Welcome back. I'm Jonathan Capehart in for Joy Reid. It was a year ago today that we saw white nationalists carrying tiki torches and chanting hate messages on the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, setting the stage for an even worse scene the next day when a rally against the removal of Confederate monuments ended in deadly violence. Counter-protester Heather Heyer was killed when a white supremacist allegedly drove his car into the crowd. On this first anniversary of the violence, the city of Charlottesville is taking no chances, imposing a state of emergency through Monday. This weekend, the organizers of the original Unite the Right rally are taking to the streets again. But this time, they're planning to demonstrate in Washington, D.C., right across from the White House, with former KKK leader David Duke among the invitees. And once again, they'll be met by counter demonstrations. Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., says the city is on high alert.
On Sunday, we know that we have people coming to our city for the sole purpose of spewing hate. It didn't make sense last year, and it doesn't make sense now. We, the people of Washington, D.C., say unequivocally that we denounce hate, we denounce anti-Semitism, and we denounce the rhetoric that we expect to hear this Sunday.
Joining me now, MSNBC national reporter Trymaine Lee, who has a new documentary called Stone Ghosts about Confederate monuments in the South. MSNBC contributor Jason Johnson, who's in Charlottesville. Richard Cohen, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Karine Jean-Pierre, senior advisor for MoveOn.org. We just heard coming into this segment from Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Let's hear from the Charlottesville mayor, Nikia Walker.
The deep-seated racism has been a major problem and still remains a problem in Charlottesville. The notion that we were talking about outsiders invading and not talking about, two UVA alum who called people into our town to wreak havoc, and were joined by some people who lived here. That's the message that I hope people are well aware of. Charlottesville is a really harmful place if you are Black, Hispanic, and low-income and white.
Richard, let me come to you first, as being at the Southern Poverty Law Center. What kind of changes have we seen in America when it comes to hate in the years since Charlottesville?
We've seen a lot of the members of the Unite the Right group that was in Charlottesville kind of fall on hard times, being taken off the internet, facing lawsuits, some arrests. And we've seen a lot of the energy from the far right move to the Northwest with groups like the Proud Boys. So, today I don't expect there to be anything like we saw in Charlottesville a year ago. And I'm less concerned with what happens outside of the White House, quite frankly, than I am concerned with what happens inside it when it comes to white nationalism.
Jason, you're there in Charlottesville. Can you give me a sense of, there's a state of emergency that's been declared, as I said, through Monday. What's the mood, the sense you get on the streets there?
There are police everywhere, Jonathan. It reminds me of going to the funeral for Clementa Pinckney several years ago in Charleston, South Carolina. There are police at almost every corner. There are volunteers at every corner. I can tell you, as a Black man, this is the nicest I have ever seen police treat me when I've been in Charlottesville, and I'm a UVA alum. The sense, if you just talk to the people who are here, it's one of sorrow. And I've talked to lots of people who are faculty and students and people who've just been a part of the Charlottesville community, and they're saying to themselves, even after a year, even with the discussions we're having, we don't know how to tell people to come back to this city. There's a huge contrast in the sort of self-reflection that I'm seeing from many white people in Charlottesville compared to the sort of obstinance and fury that I saw from lots of white people in Ferguson, Missouri just a couple years ago.
That's actually a good point, Karine. A poll out by Quinnipiac from June 27th to July 1st asked people whether they thought President Trump emboldens racist people to express their beliefs. And you see there, well, I think it just flipped, but it's 55% believe that President Trump emboldens racists. And you see there, 49% of people from that same poll believe that President Trump is racist. I wrote a piece last week saying, yes, Donald Trump, you are racist. What does it say about America a year after Charlottesville that we have a president, despite the tweet he sent out this morning saying, acknowledging the anniversary, that we have a president who gives license to white supremacists to not only express their beliefs openly, but to march on the streets of an American city.
Yeah, it means that we have a dangerous president in the White House right now who is indeed a white supremacist, a white nationalist, whichever word, phrase you want to use to call him. There's also, Vox had an article that just came out recently about a report that shows that 11 million white Americans think like alt-right. I mean, those are numbers. That's a big number. That's incredibly concerning for where we are as a country. I also, Jonathan, went to Charlottesville this past week, and one of the things that stuck out to me as I was listening to the mayor of Charlottesville speak when she says that Charlottesville is dangerous for essentially people of color, brown and black people, is that right next to a courthouse there's a prominent statue of Stonewall Jackson. And I went down there to talk to activists and just kind of to see how things were going down there. And just think about it. If you are a person of color and you're going to the courthouse to get justice, to figure out how to fix a problem or how to deal with an issue, a legal issue, you have to pass by Stonewall Jackson. And that is the message that's been given to the people of Charlottesville. And I think that plays nationally as well as how people of color feel in this country.
Trymaine, I want to bring you in here and actually show a little piece from your documentary, Stone Ghosts. Karine was talking about going down to that statue of Stonewall Jackson. You talked to someone about this auction block, that monument that is in town. Let's take a look at that, and I'll talk to you about it on the other side.
So what was it like growing up with that auction block right there on the corner?
It was like an embarrassment. I don't need to see that block to know what the past was.
It made you mad because I could say that could have been my great-grandma, my great-grandpa. You bring them in on a boat and then you sell them. How do you try to memorialize something like that?
It is totally unfair and unreal that people can actually sit there and say that, oh, well, we're just saving history. No, what you're doing is you're spitting in our faces. That's what you're doing.
That's really interesting because I'd never heard of this slave rock, this monument, and we were always talking about Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and these monuments, and yet here's something that is supposedly supposed to acknowledge a horror, but it doesn't really.
Well, here's the thing. So what we saw in Charlottesville was sparked in defense of Robert E. Lee, a statue. But we always knew it was about more than just a statue or monument. Right. It's a proxy for white power and white supremacy. But there's another kind of monument, artifacts all across this country, like that auction block, which is an actual auction block where human beings were bought and sold in this community by people of this community for 100+ years. When black folks walk down that street, they see that block there, and it's a reminder of how they were dehumanized by people in this community. There had been a debate on city council. They voted 6-1 to keep the block there for educational purposes, right? The lone black dissenting vote was the only black city councilman on the council. So beyond the big statues, the obelisk in Fairview, Kentucky, where Jefferson Davis was born, 350 feet tall, you have the statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. Then you have other things that are literally baked into the fabric of our communities that are sheer reminders of just what happened to so many of us in this country.
Did you, Mayor Landrieu, Mitch Landrieu, when he was the mayor of New Orleans and caught all sorts of hell when he removed, I think it was 3 statues and 1 monument there in the Crescent City, gave an incredible speech about history and the myth of the lost cause, and how this reverence for this lost cause has blinded people to history. In your going down into southern states, are people from what you saw, are people still blinded by history?
Their understanding of history and the Civil War, and by large measure race relations, is shaped by that lost cause propaganda. Early on, the Daughters of the Confederate Veterans and other groups that were sympathetic to the Confederacy took control of local school boards to ensure that what their children were being taught would set the stage for generations. So you get a whole generation or two of politicians who are supporting segregation and other racist policies. But the people on the ground in rural areas and in the cities still believe that the Civil War was more about sovereignty sovereignty and states' rights than slavery. They'll continue almost to a person. They said blacks owned slaves too. There were white slaves. They don't understand the difference between indentured servitude and chattel slavery. But the mythology is so prevalent, it blankets whole communities to the point where when you talk to them, or if you visit local museums, the framing of the entire war, there are whole sections on the black Confederates who fought for the Confederacy. The mythology and the stories and the narrative that has been shaped by those early propagandists pervades today.
Richard, you're there in Montgomery, Alabama. You're right there in the cradle of the Confederacy. Talk more about that.
Well, you know, I think the phenomenon that your prior guest spoke to is very, very real. But I'd also point out something else. After Nikki Haley took down the Confederate flag in the Capitol in South Carolina, we saw 300 pro-Confederate flag rallies around the country. They were concentrated but not limited to the South. We saw rallies in Oregon, the state of Washington, Pennsylvania. And what those rallies were expressions of white pride. Right now, we have about 1,700 monuments, street names, and even the names of military bases after so-called Confederate war heroes. So the problem, I think, is concentrated in the South, but not limited to it by any means.
Jason, give me your... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and all of this, as we're going through what I think is an important history lesson about where these monuments are and how they affect us today, all of this has to be placed directly in the lap of the President of the United States. Donald Trump is a terrorist sympathizer. You cannot be a white nationalist and not be a terrorist. You can't accomplish white nationalism in America without violence. And the president has increasingly coddled and supported, both verbally and in policy, terrorists. And I think to the degree that we talk about racism, that's fine, right? But racism can go over people's heads. This is terror. There was a terror attack in Charlottesville. It's 2018, and we've got Nazis marching on the capital of our country. And our president doesn't do anything about it. So until we start viewing this as a terror attack, a slow-moving terror attack encouraged by the President of the United States, I think we're going to be missing the boat on how dangerous some of this behavior really is.
And, you know, Karine, again, I know I asked you this question in an unrelated block last hour, but again, it comes back to if the President of the United States is not going to speak out against terror, as the way I think Jason accurately puts it, that puts the onus on the co-equal branch of government, Congress, which is controlled by the president's party. And yet we have heard nothing from the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, or from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Right, and that's exactly what we were talking about earlier. You have a party who's supposed to be about family values and patriotism, who are doing everything that they can to seemingly, at least on the House side, not get to the bottom of what happened with Russia attacking our elections, or not stopping or taking real action to stop or even try to censure the president after his comments a year ago. And it's really appalling. And so that's why November is incredibly important. This is why people need to come out and vote. This is why Democrats need to take back the House. I mean, that's the only way we're going to see a guardrail, a stopgap to this runaway train that is the Trump administration.
And I know we're running out of time, but I want to play one more piece from Trymaine's documentary, Stone Ghost.
If you don't have some type of proof, then a generation from now, you'll have people arguing it, and it may just vanish.
But considering that for a great number of people in this country, those things represent deep trauma and great violence against people.
But haven't we got beyond that? How many people? Yeah. Well,
right.
How many people living in America today were slaves? How many people living in America today own slaves? It's roughly zero. So we should have got beyond that.
But we don't have, I'll take myself for example, we don't have our last name, we don't have our religion, we don't have this tongue I'm speaking with is English.
This language is not my native language either.
Right. But you have great benefit.
Everybody in America has a benefit. It's the greatest country in the world.
But not everyone has a benefit from slavery, correct?
Everybody living in America today has a great benefit and great opportunity.
The people of African descent in this country, people who are descendants of slaves, what benefit did they get from slavery?
They're here.
Thank you, Karine, for that gasp. I was taken aback by, so we should have gotten over it. But to hear him say, they're here,
There's this idea, and this is part of the mythology and romance around the lost cause and what these symbols represent, is that we were all better off under slavery, that even enslaved Africans were better off, and that America is the greatest because of those virtues sown in those early days.
I mean, it is incredible that in 2018 that we're still having this conversation, still having to educate people, still having to remind people that even though there aren't slaves here or people who own slaves who are still alive, that the vestiges of slavery, the vestiges of stealing people from their native land, forcing them to create a country and then shunting them aside once they were emancipated, that there is something morally wrong with that, and that has to be reckoned with. I'm going to have to leave my little sermon there, right there. Thank you, Trymaine Lee, Jason Johnson, and Richard Cohen. Karine will be back with us later in the show. And Trymaine's documentary, Stone Ghosts in the South, is online right now at nbcnews.com/stoneghosts.